Good afternoon. I am Dilip Jeste from San Diego. I want to begin by apologizing for not being there in person. I really wanted to be at this ICGP meeting, which has been put together by Angel and his colleagues. ICGP is very close to my heart. As some of you may know, I was the founding president of the ICGP for 3 years. And I've never missed an ICGP meeting until now. So I'm very sorry for not being there. But thank you for this opportunity to talk to you through this video presentation. I also want to say that I'm honored to be on the honorific committee of the ICGP. I wish you all a wonderful conference. Today, I'm going to talk on positive psychiatry and neuroscience. And because this is a geriatric psychopharmacology meeting, I'll be focusing more on positive geriatric psychiatry and neuroscience. First of all, in terms of potential conflicts of interest, I don't have any relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. In my talk today, I'm going to begin with some of our studies on successful aging of the brain and mind. Next, I will summarize a few of the studies of positive psychological traits, specifically resilience, optimism, and social engagement. Next, I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing our recent research on wisdom. Then I will talk about neurobiology of positive psychological traits, mainly resilience and then wisdom. Finally, I will discuss the interventions that are relevant for this presentation. Before talking about successful aging, just a word about what is positive psychiatry in general and positive geriatric psychiatry in particular. Psychiatry has been traditionally viewed as a branch of medicine that is devoted to treatment of people with mental illnesses. And obviously, that has to be the primary mission for psychiatrists. However, I think our scope needs to be broader than that. A number of studies in medicine have shown the value of positive psychological traits like resilience, optimism, and social engagement for enhancing not just mental health, but also physical health and even longevity. Therefore, I believe that psychiatry, including geriatric psychiatry, needs to expand its focus to studies of positive psychological traits and clinical application of appropriate interventions to people with mental or physical illness. My interest in positive psychiatry began with our studies in schizophrenia. For the last 20 plus years, we have been studying schizophrenia in older people. As many of you know, schizophrenia has been traditionally thought of as dementia precox. That's a term that Kraepelin used. And by that he meant that this was an illness with a progressive downhill course. What we have found over the past 20-25 years is that that's not the case. In a majority of cases, the course of schizophrenia in later life is stable and non-deteriorating. As a matter of fact, there is improvement in psychotic symptoms, improvement in treatment adherence with fewer psychotic relapses. There is age-related decline in physical health, as occurs in everybody, but surprisingly, there is improvement in mental health. Look at this slide. This was a study using SF-36, the most commonly used scale for self-rated quality of well-being that has ever been used. It has two components, physical and mental. The red line represents the physical component, and you see that the physical health seems to decline with age. That's as you would expect. Interestingly, the blue line, which represents the mental health component, actually seems to improve with age. So, even in older people with schizophrenia, with aging, there is improvement in mental functioning, although the physical functioning declines. In any studies of older people, there is survivor bias. The sickest people with schizophrenia die young. So when you study older population, that's already kind of a hardy cohort. So part of the reason of the result could be the survivor cohort, but I don't think that's the main reason. When we have followed people, middle-aged people, for 20-some years, we have found that there is progressive improvement in their psychosocial functioning. So this finding made me wonder if what we were seeing, this improvement in psychosocial functioning with aging, this was something that is unique, related to the population that we were studying, or whether this was a general phenomenon that occurred even in the population at large. So we started a study of successful aging in the larger community-based sample. We have studied more than 3,000 seniors in the San Diego community. We have given them a survey questionnaire that takes about an hour and a half to complete. It includes a number of different scales. In addition, we asked one question. We asked them to rate themselves on a scale of successful aging from 1 to 10. 1 is the worst, 10 is the best. We don't define successful aging for them, but we ask people to rate themselves on successful aging on this scale according to what they feel. We have found that only 18% of our sample has freedom from physical illness and disability. In other words, 82% of our sample had some kind of serious physical problem. It may be arthritis, diabetes, sometimes even cancer, heart disease. Many of these people have psychosocial stressors. Some of them have lost their spouses, sometimes children, financial stresses. So this is a general senior population that we are all familiar with. In other words, these are not supernormal aged people that we are studying. So in this population, what kind of a rating would we expect on successful aging on a scale from 1 to 10? 1 is the worst, 10 is the best. We thought people would give themselves 3, 4, or 5. We were surprised to find that most people gave themselves 7, 8, 9, or even 10. The average rating was 8.4. So, although the physical health seemed to be declining, the people thought that they were aging well. And not only did they think they were aging well, but they were actually doing well in non-physical modalities. Most of them were living independently. They had positive adaptation, active engagement with life, sense of mastery or growth, life satisfaction, and good cognitive function. What were the significant associations of this self-rated successful aging? The main associations were attitudes, health, and activities. In terms of attitudes, these were positive psychological attitudes: optimism, resilience, self-efficacy, positive attitude toward aging, low level of perceived stress. Everybody has stress, but these are people who were less overwhelmed with stress. In terms of health, a very important association was depression. Low level of depressive symptoms was a significant predictor. And lastly, activities. physical, cognitive or social activities. Physical activities includes exercise at any level. For people in wheelchairs, they can throw beach ball to one another, that counts as exercise. Cognitive activity would be reading, writing, computer use. Social activities would be socialization with friends. The drawback of the study that I presented was that this was a sample of convenience. So one could argue that these were successful agers who wanted to participate in the study and the findings are not generalizable. That's why we have started a new study called SAGE study, stand for Successful Aging Evaluation. This is a study of different domains of successful aging: physical, cognitive and psychosocial. We use what is called a structured multi-cohort longitudinal design. My statistician colleague Wes Thompson is the statistician who developed this design. One of the features of our study is that the sample we selected was selected randomly. We use a method called random digit dialing. So instead of choosing the sample of convenience, we chose randomly a reasonably representative sample. Although we did oversample people in their 80s and 90s because of increased risk of attrition in that population because of death or disability. We had a telephone interview that included a cognitive test, surveys similar to the kind that I described earlier, and we are also collecting their saliva samples for genetic analysis, and the plan is to follow these people longitudinally. In terms of self-rated successful aging, you will find that their scores are almost identical to what I described earlier. Again, most people give themselves 7, 8, 9 or 10. So they think that they are aging well. This is the cognitive test that was based on the phone interview. What you find here is that with aging, the cognitive performance seems to decline. This is what one would expect. There would be decrease in working memory, learning abilities, etc. So some decline in cognition is to be expected with age. Then we use a scale that I mentioned earlier, SF36, for physical and mental health functioning. The physical component, as you will see here, seems to also decline with age. Again, as one would expect, physical health declines with age. Look at the mental health component. The mental health component does not decline with age. As a matter of fact, shows some increase with age. So although the physical health is declining, the mental health seems to be improving. This is even more striking. This green broken line shows the percentage of people who have no physical disability. So when you look at the people in the 50 to 60 age range, about 60% of the people had no disability. By the time you come to people over 90, fewer than 10% are free of disability. In other words, as people age, the number of people with disability increases and those without disability decreases. This is obviously as what we would expect. Look at the self-rated successful aging. It seems to go in the opposite direction. As people get older, they seem to rate themselves higher on self-rated successful aging. So this is what I call paradox of aging. That with aging, physical health declines, some cognitive abilities decline. At the same time, the subjective successful aging as well as other components of mental health and psychosocial functioning seem to improve with age. And it looks like positive psychological traits such as resilience, optimism may be related to this, and I will talk about them next. Obviously, there is some heterogeneity. Some seniors do better than others. I want to say a few words about resilience, optimism, and social engagement. Resilience may be defined as the ability to adapt positively to adversity and to grow from it. We use a 25-item scale called Connor-Davidson scale for resilience. We found that the significant correlates of resilience were higher emotional well-being, optimism, subjective successful aging, social engagement, and fewer cognitive complaints. So overall, better psychosocial functioning. Number of other published studies have shown that resilience is also associated with better physical health and even greater longevity. There have been several studies of optimism and physical health. I'm just going to show you one study. This was a Dutch study of 545 men over the age of 64 who were free of cardiovascular disease and cancer at baseline. These people were then followed longitudinally for 15 years. All of these subjects were given a survey similar to what we gave, and it also included a scale for optimism. Based on their scores on the scale of optimism at baseline, the investigators divided these people into three groups. The upper line shows people with highest level of optimism. The bottom line shows those with the highest level of pessimism, and then the intermediate group. These people were then followed for 15 years from the perspective of mortality from cardiovascular disease. What the investigators found was that the most optimistic people had 50% less mortality than the most pessimistic people from cardiovascular disease over a 15-year period. This is really a startling finding that high level of optimism was associated with a 50% decrease in cardiovascular mortality over a 15-year period. This was a sophisticated study, so they controlled for the usual factors such as past history, family history of heart disease, history of hypertension, use of statins, smoking, and so on. Regarding social engagement, this is even more impressive. This was a very recent meta-analysis of 148 studies of social engagement that included more than 300,000 people, mostly adults of all ages. The reviewers found that people with strong social relationship had 50% increased likelihood of survival over the study period compared to people who had a low level of social engagement. And this finding was consistent across age, gender, initial health status, cause of death, and follow-up period. So social engagement actually rivaled other major health risk factors like smoking, hypertension, obesity, sedentary lifestyle. So all of these studies show that things like resilience, optimism, social engagement, they're not only good for mental health, they're also good for physical health and even longevity. One positive trait that we at UC San Diego are particularly interested in is wisdom. And this is an area on which there is much less research done compared to resilience, optimism, and social engagement. When you look at cognitive changes across the lifespan, it is well established that several cognitive abilities go down with age. These are called fluid mechanics. These are things like working memory, which decline with age. But there are some that stay pretty stable. These are called crystallized pragmatics. For example, vocabulary usually does not decline with age. The question is there anything cognitively that actually improves with age? Why do we think so? This slide shows Dr. Montalcini, an Italian scientist who got Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1986. Recently, she celebrated her 100th birthday. And she said that my mind is sharper today than when I was 20. Another Nobel laureate, Eric Kandel, psychiatrist and a neuroscientist at University of Columbia, who is now 81, he said that I think I do science better now than I did when I was younger. In science, judgment is so important, and I have a better understanding of which problems are important and which are not. So what these folks are saying is that actually they found improvement in their cognitive abilities with aging, some cognitive abilities. Is that wisdom? So what is wisdom? Wisdom is an ancient concept from philosophical and religious perspective, but there is relatively little scientific research done on wisdom. If you look at the number of publications on wisdom in scientific literature, most of the studies, whatever are there, began in 1970. In 1970, we found only about 15 papers on wisdom that we could access in the PubMed that had wisdom in their title. During the last decade, that number has increased to more than 350. So this has become an increasingly important area for science, although the literature is still limited. We wanted to find out how do the modern scientists, mostly Western, define wisdom. So we looked at all the definitions of wisdom included in the modern empirical research papers. And then we wanted to see what were the common elements of wisdom in this definition. We found 6 elements that were common to this definition. One was pragmatic knowledge of life or social decision making. Second was emotional regulation. This is opposite of impulsivity. Third is pro-social attitudes and behaviors such as compassion, empathy, altruism. Fourth is reflection and self-understanding, or what one might call insight. Fifth is dealing effectively with uncertainty or ambiguity, in other words, decisiveness. And lastly, tolerance of divergent values. So this is the definition of wisdom based on modern scientific literature, which is mostly Western. So one question that people raise is that wisdom is a cultural concept that varies from one place to another and would vary over a period of time. To see if that was true, we wanted to look at a very different document to look at the definition of wisdom, and that was the Gita. This is kind of Hindu Bible, if you will. This was written several thousand years BC. So we used a quantitative qualitative method under the consultation with a medical anthropologist, looking at translations of the Gita into English and looking at the context in which synonyms or antonyms of wisdom were used. Basically what we found was that the components of wisdom as described in the Gita were general knowledge of life, emotional regulation, pro-social behaviors such as compassion, sacrifice, insight, self-reflection, and decisiveness or acting in the face of uncertainty. These exactly are the first 5 of the 6 elements that I described in my previous slide based on the modern Western definition of wisdom. There are of course a couple of differences. For example, love of God is stressed in the Gita, which is a religious document. And secondly, like most Eastern cultures, the Gita puts less emphasis on materialistic pursuit. What is striking though is not the differences but the similarities between this definition of wisdom put together in a document that was published thousands of years BC in an entirely different part of the world with what we use today in the modern Western world. So, to us this suggested that wisdom may not be a purely cultural concept, but maybe more biologically based, and that may be the reason why it has not changed over centuries and over the geographic periods. One thing we also found was that there is some evidence that wisdom seems to increase with aging. In Eastern culture, it is commonly believed that indeed older people are wiser. But are there empirical data supporting that? Some data supporting that. For example, Baltis and Baltis found that older people continue to exhibit new forms of learning. Similarly, we found that aging was associated with greater happiness, better mental health, better management of interpersonal relationship, and a couple of recent studies in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences have found that older age is associated with certain components of wisdom such as social reasoning and decision making. We had a commentary in the JAMA published a couple of years ago in which we argued that wisdom may have evolutionary significance. Humans have a very long aging period. This is the period in which physical health declines, several cognitive abilities decline, the fertility declines and reaches rock bottom soon after menopause or climacteric. So how can one justify aging from the evolutionary perspective? We think that something must improve with aging in human, and that may be wisdom. So it is useful for self because the wisdom may help people navigate the social system for better care of themselves. But it may also have generational significance. The so-called grandma hypothesis of being the wise grandparent being able to transfer wisdom to their grandchildren. So wisdom may actually have some evolutionary significance. The goal of my talk, as I said, was neuroscience of positive psychiatry. So what do we know about neuroscience or neurobiology of these positive psychological traits? There is quite a bit of literature in resilience, and over the last 15-20 years, a number of researchers have defined the genetics as well as molecular biology and neurocircuitry involved in resilience. Very briefly, I would mention that resilience is an active process and not just an absence of pathology. The literature in this area clearly shows that there is an interaction between the genes, environment, and behavior that promote resilience in some individuals. There are various genetic polymorphisms that are relevant to resilience, and at the same time, the adaptive behavior helps expression of those genes. Here at San Diego, we have been particularly interested in neurobiology of wisdom. As I mentioned, we found that the definition of wisdom seemed to be largely similar across cultures, across centuries, which suggested to us a possibility that wisdom is also biologically based. So if it is biologically based, where in the brain would it be? How do we find how any function is located in the brain? I think most of you are familiar with these Brodmann's areas. For example, the area 4 is a motor area. How did people know that area 4 is motor area? Scientists found out, as well as the clinicians, that when area 4 was damaged, the result was paralysis. You could see in animals, you could see in humans, you could see experimentally, but you could also see, for example, somebody with stroke with, in fact, in the region of area 4 would have hemiplegia or paraplegia. So, we asked a question, is there evidence that damage to specific areas of the brain resulted in loss of components that were related to wisdom? Now, this damage could have occurred as a result of injury or disease. There are several cases of injury reported in the literature, specific brain injury that resulted in loss of things like social decision making, emotional regulation, compassion, the things that are associated with wisdom. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Phineas Gage, the construction worker in Vermont who had this major injury in which a large iron rod went through the back of his left hand, came through the top of his head. Miraculously, he survived, and he had very few neurological deficits or even neuropsychological deficit except for a radical change in his behavior. And if you look at his description, that he became fitful, irreverent, profane, non-differential, impatient, obstinate, childish. This is the exact opposite of wisdom. There have been studies of where in the brain was the damage, and there have been papers published in Science doing some computerized studies of his skull that show that the damage was more or less restricted to the left prefrontal region. And there are dozens such cases reported in the literature since then. There is also a disease called frontotemporal dementia, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in which if you look at the symptoms, they are the exact antithesis of wisdom. So this is a disease in which there is damage more or less restricted to the prefrontal region that results in loss of traits associated with wisdom. So on the basis of this literature, as well as several other genetic, neurochemical and neuroimaging studies, we postulated that there are 4 main brain regions involved in the wisdom, or there is a neurocircuitry of wisdom that involves prefrontal cortex, especially the dorsolateral and ventromedial, plus anterior cingulate and the amygdala. We don't know if this is the true neurocircuitry of wisdom, but this is our hypothesis, and we are presenting this as a heuristic model that other researchers can either prove or disprove. Next, just one word about neuroplasticity of aging. As I mentioned, there is evidence that wisdom, or at least some components of wisdom, increase with aging. How can anything increase with aging? Well, there are some evidence, and we have published some literature reviews of both structural and functional brain changes with aging that suggests that larger structures and stronger connections are associated with better brain functioning in later life. So these may suggest either greater brain or cognitive result or greater compensation for the deficits that occur. There is also some evidence for synaptogenesis and even neurogenesis with aging. So these are the components that may be associated with what is called neuroplasticity of aging, or the continued ability of the brain to reform itself in older age in spite of the various degenerative changes that are occurring. Finally, just a few words about possible interventions that can improve the positive psychological traits and overall well-being in later life. There have been several studies done at Yale by Levy and colleagues, and these investigators found that interventions to improve attitude towards aging were successful in reducing the cardiovascular response to stress. Also, they found that people who had a positive attitude toward aging live on an average 7.5 years longer than people who had a negative attitude towards aging. So this suggests that things like attitude toward aging not only have impact on longevity, but that we can actually change people's attitude toward aging, which should have positive impact on biology of stress. In terms of wisdom, there is some very interesting social experiment that is currently going on in the US, supported by the MacArthur Foundation. This is called Experience Core. In this program, older people in the community over the age of 65, they volunteer to spend at least 15 hours a week working in downtown schools. These are schools with children who have no grandparents and not even parents in many cases. So these older people who work in the school, they serve not only as mentors but as kind of proxy grandparents. The experience so far has shown that not only these kids do well as a result of this program, their school performance improves, but these older people, their wisdom improves and their self-satisfaction improves. So what we need are really intervention that would promote these positive psychological traits. And so this is my last slide on positive psychiatry and aging. In a recent editorial in the British Journal of Psychiatry, we have proposed a new model for positive psychiatry of aging. This model focuses on recovery, promotion of successful aging, neuroplasticity, prevention, and intervention to enhance positive psychological traits such as resilience, social engagement, optimism, attitude towards aging, and wisdom. There is clearly an urgent need to increase research, both clinical and neurobiological, as well as intervention research on positive psychological traits, especially in older people. Let me stop here. Thank you for your attention. Again, I apologize for not being there, but thank the organizers for this opportunity to talk to you through this video, and wish you all a great conference and hope to see you all soon.